Alright, so we're coming back into the Dropbox scenario. So now we need to execute phase 2, stay in. To do this, we're going to be using a different C2 tool. In fact, just to give you all more of a reference to practice with, I'm going to do this exercise in the lecture with a C2 tool called Empire. But in the course materials and assignment, I'm going to point you to another C2 tool that I really love called Merlin. I'm going to challenge you to see if you can follow Merlin's documentation and do this exact same exercise with both tools. You see, Merlin is very similar in concept to Empire, they're just built on two different technologies. And in fairness, that's the case of pretty much all C2 tools. In fact, that's the point of this lesson. More specifically, the point of this is just to demonstrate how similar the configuration of many of these C2 tools are. Once you understand the fundamentals of one C2 configuration, setting up and testing new C2 tools can become exciting and easy, and it vastly opens up the capabilities you can use for future operations. So now that we're actually on the system, I'm going to do some basic checks of running processes to see if AV is running at all. You'll notice we're actually back on the 104 box instead of the 100 box. There were some complications during testing and development of the course materials, so we've simply switched hosts, but we're still operating under the same credentials and same account, just a new host to facilitate our needs. So if you caught that, good on you for noticing the IP change. But all in all, our mission stays the same, and we still have some objectives to achieve. So first, I'm going to do just what I said. I'm going to take a look at the task list to see the running processes, and we don't see too many crazy things going on. We see our command prompt process and probably the system that psexec generated, but everything else looks pretty normal. So I'm going to run sc query for WinDefend again, see if we have any default antivirus running. It does look like it's running, so we're going to stop WinDefend and run the sc query WinDefend again. Looks like that stopped. So awesome. We don't have AV running anymore. Now the last thing I want to do is just ping an external source to make sure that we have some kind of internet. Looks like we're good. Ping and google.com seem to work great. Alright, so it looks like we're good to go. So before we get started with Empire, I want to point out that Empire is a similarly known tool just like Metasploit is. Now, Empire is far more focused on post-exploitation C2 activity like we're doing now. It's built for red team stuff like this. Now, Empire technically did cease development in favor of a new tool known as Covenant. However, while Covenant is awesome, and I do recommend it, Empire is actually still actively being maintained by BC Security at the time of this recording. They've actually added a ton of new features and even a couple new add-on tools that take advantage of the Empire API. If you want to learn more, check out the course references. Back to the scenario though. Keep in mind that so far that we're only checking for local host-based protection mechanisms. We don't know if there are any network-based mechanisms existing in this environment. Even if we don't see anything that indicates that there might be something on the host itself, there still could be at minimum a firewall or a network IDS that's upstream sniffing everything coming in and out of the environment. This could be a downfall if we're not careful. Fortunately, both Empire and Merlin are going to let us call out over HTTP-based protocols that can even be encrypted with HTTPS to look like common web traffic. That said, signatures can be developed for this type of activity too. So, while we're probably going to be just fine in this scenario, keep that in mind as a red teamer. You may go up against some really awesome blue teamers in a really hardened network. It's important that you really study your target for these scenarios, but most importantly, remember that you're emulating an adversarial threat for the blue teams. Stick to the TTPs. If they're able to stop you, that's a good thing. Red team is arguably a defensive role like any other in that light. You want to be stopped if it falls in line with the threat that you're trying to emulate. Ideally, these scenarios result in measuring how well an organization holds up against the legitimate threat that they are worried about. If that threat is an ever-evolving advanced ATP, then sure, maybe it's important for your team to pull out all the tricks. But if the TTPs that you're using align with a group that uses off-the-shelf tools like Empire or Metasploit, stick to that. And if the controls the organization has in place successfully defend against those things, that's a very good thing for the organization. I put in those asides into these lessons just to keep us grounded in what red teaming is. This isn't an excuse to just hack systems and play pretend criminals. We have legitimate value that we are bringing to an organization, and the tradecraft and processes within that are important. So back to our scenario again. We have internet access, and now I'm going to live off the land a little bit with a tool called certutil, and that's going to let us actually download my stager that I'll have stored on my C2 server. But before I do that, I actually need to make our stager. We don't have any of our C2 stuff set up yet. So I'm going to come over to our Kali C2 server, and actually PowerShell Empire is another tool that you can just install in Kali. If you're using the Terraform C2 instance, it should already be installed, but otherwise you can just apt install PowerShell-Empire and you're ready to go. Alternatively, you can clone it from GitHub and follow the instructions there. The actual GitHub for BC security will be in the references. But to start, all we have to do is sudo PowerShell-Empire. It'll boot things up, welcome us to the Empire, and here we go. So before we generate a stager, I actually want to generate a listener. In all honesty, that's kind of intuitive because our stagers will actually be associated with our listeners. It makes it easier to generate the stagers that way. So we're going to say use listener, and we have a couple options if we tab complete. We have DBX, HTTP, HTTP-COM, HTTP-Foreign, HTTP-Hop, all these. You can even do interpreters or even redirectors. Empire's capable of a lot of things. But we're just going to stick to the HTTP listener for now. We'll say info, and now we need to set a couple values. I'm going to name this for my own sake. We're going to call this Dropbox. So we know this is the listener for the Dropbox scenario. Then we're going to set our host. This is going to be the actual public IP that we're listening on. If you recall, we actually have our C2 domain set up at udemy-c2.injection.sh. Now if we look at our info, those two fields have been filled out. The bind IP is actually the interface that we want to bind on. We're just going to say bind on all interfaces for now, but we could just specify ETH0 if we wanted to, since we know that's the proper one. The port, by default, is port 80. We're actually going to leave that as it is. We're no longer using Meterpreter. This is a brand new C2 server setup using the same configuration, so we're going to listen on port 80. All right, so now all we have to do is execute that listener. Listener has successfully been started. Now we're going to back out and say use stager. This is where we'll actually generate our stager. And here are our options for stager. So we're actually able to impact multiple systems. We have some Linux support, some OS X support, and Windows support. Obviously, we're targeting a Windows system. So I'm going to stick with the launcher_bat. That seems to be a really good one to go with. You could do the Windows C# exe, but that's going to be a Visual Studio project that will actually have to go and compile. So not as helpful. There's some Visual Basic scripts. You can do macros. There's lots of fun options you can do. A lot of times I see Empire using the context of these like copy paste stagers. So you've got maybe like RDP access and paste a PowerShell one-liner or something like that. So a lot of the times the stagers aren't really even used when I see demos, but we're going to use the launcher batch file because that's going to be really simple for us in our scenario. So we'll say Windows launcher_bat. Check out the info for this. And now we need to set a listener for it. So we're going to set the listener to the Dropbox listener that we've set. So this is going to be the name of the listener. So when we set that listener name earlier, this is what we're referencing. And now it's just going to know to generate this. And it's going to put it in /temp for us as launcher.bat. And that's where the out file parameter is. So we'll just say generate. And there we go. That's all there is to it. Now we need to actually go host this. So this is in /temp. We got a lot of things in /temp, but the thing we care about the most is that launcher.bat. So I'm going to make just a www directory to keep things organized and move that launcher in there. Looks like we got to do a sudo because we were running as root before. And just to keep things simple, I'll go ahead and sudo as root so we can interact with this easier. All right, so now I'm going to serve up a simple HTTP server. Now this is going to cause us to have clear text communication when we're passing our agent down. And remember when I talked about the networks controls? Well, if there are network security controls in place in any kind, this is not a great move. Ideally, what we would want to do is actually configure something with HTTPS, like so an actual web server, use Let's Encrypt, and all that kind of stuff. However, if you've never configured a web server with HTTPS before, there's a million tutorials for that. And I'll kindly link some in the course materials, but it's really not relevant for the scope of this course. And if anything, it's going to slow us down a little bit as we're working through. So just realize that this is not a secure configuration for transferring files. But remember, that's not always a bad thing. Think about the TTPs you're trying to emulate, and also think about what you need to accomplish in a scenario. Sometimes you get put in a pinch. Sometimes blue teams block your controls, and you have to find another way around. And sometimes that's not always the most secure communications. But if it works, it works. In this case, it's going to work out just fine. So we'll start an HTTP server on port 8080. Gotta spell server correctly. All right, cool. So we're serving this up on port 8080 on our C2 server, and we're going to be able to download this just fine. So to download this, I'm actually going to move up a couple directories so that we don't get spammed with a whole bunch of stuff in System32. But we're going to live off the land a little bit. We're going to use certutil. Certutil is a nice little Windows utility that's built in that will help us download files. It's a little bit easier using than PowerShell's invoke web request, and it's a little bit more versatile when it comes to older systems. Now this is Windows 7, so we do have PowerShell, but we should have Certutil too. So we need to specify the parameters URL cache -split -f, and then we can specify the address of where our C2 server is, where we're hosting that stager. So in this case, it'll be udemy-c2.injection.sh port 8080, and we're wanting the launcher.bat, and we'll save it as launcher.bat. Check over here. Looks like we actually got our request in. That's great. Awesome. It completed successfully. So now we have our launcher.bat. Now that's not an exactly inconspicuous name, so we're going to kind of maybe move this a little bit. So we'll say move launcher.bat to sys.bat. That's what we'll call it. So that's a little bit more inconspicuous. A sys.bat sitting in the C drive. Unless you're a sysadmin who knows they didn't put it there, a user's not going to notice. Seems kind of inconspicuous. Awesome. Now, all we need to do is execute this. Now, before I move further, I want to just point out that where we store and run this is actually relatively important this time. If we run our net user command, we seem to be the primary user on this box, and we already know that we're the domain admin, we're the administrator, right? So there's the administrator, there's Biggie, and there's guest, but Biggie is an admin locally, and then we're just an admin, period. So if we run a quick who am I, we see that we are running as system, fortunately. Now, if we were running as anything else, or for some reason this lowers our privileges to just administrator or Biggie, like a user level context, this could artificially restrict some of our access. So in the interest of moving quickly, because I have the proper permissions, I'm able to store this in the C drive with no problem. But otherwise, I may want to copy this to other directories, like the user's documents, or perhaps their app data folder, something that's accessible at a user level, just in case privileges get downgraded, so we can still execute more backdoors as long as we have access. So obviously the better way to do all this is to have an initial staged program that will check all the permissions, automate writing to the app data directories, and even automate elevating privileges or something like that if it's applicable. That said, while this isn't a fancy or sophisticated scenario that we have set up here, it can still be very effective depending on your TTPs and depending on the defensive controls on the network. You know, I can clearly see that this is an older Windows system. And while Event Viewer may help defenders trace down and access file creation activities and stuff like that, I'm an admin. I can always clear that stuff out. We also know that there's no alerts being generated for anything. They don't have a fancy SIM or anything set up unless it's like just the upstream IDS. That's theoretical at this point. So if anything, if we move this sys.bat around, maybe call it something else, something more interesting, a user may be enticed to click on it. And that'll just give us more shells. You know, don't knock the silly things. Think outside the box a little bit. You'd be surprised how far the silly little things might get you. For example, if we called it pinball.bat and placed it on the desktop, maybe the user will click it. That could be good for us to get back in if we've lost all other access. Now, as you recall, we set up our listener as we were setting up our stager. So all that's left to do is run it. And remember, 2 is 1 and 1 is none. So I'm going to try to run this like 3 times. All right, so we'll start with just our initial execution just to make sure everything works. So we'll say sys.bat. And we'll go over to our C2 server. All right, looks like we got that initial agent communication in. We're sending that second stage. Cool, so that worked out just fine. And we'll run it again just like we wanted to, now that we know everything's working. All right, cool, so we got another agent check-in. I actually had to log out and log back in, so we're gonna do that one more time to get our shell since we're pretty much good to go. We have this access, and while it's not ideal for us to keep logging in and out and generating these artifacts, it is effective and it's going to help us out. So we're gonna do that one more time. And I will note that if you actually fail out of some in-packet stuff, especially like psexec, it's possible that your service is still running, which could actually enable a new vulnerability on the host itself. I've seen this in a few videos on YouTube. I believe one popular YouTuber, Ipsec, I really enjoy them, demonstrated this as actually a way to kind of prevesc back onto a system. So keep in mind the artifacts that your tools are generating. I know I've said that a lot, but it's really, really important. All right, we'll run this one more time and just kind of leave it where it is. And we should have 3 agents checked in. All right, cool. So we'll back out and then we'll just say agents. And there are all our agents. We've got 3 agents running a system as a PowerShell process, and we're pretty much good to go. So if we run a quick help, we can see kind of all that we can do. So let's interact with an agent. That's what we want to do now. So we'll interact with agent K68 because that was our first one. And if we type help again, we can see what other options we have. All right, so we're going to use a show command, and I wanted to run task list because I actually want to see what running tasks are going, so we can see what our instances actually look like on the system. All right, so we got that task list back and everything's working. And if we look, we actually just see, here we are. We have 3 instances of PowerShell running. So this is us. We're pretty obvious that we're running. So unless this user's a PowerShell heavy user, we're kind of sticking out like a sore thumb right now for anybody looking for threats between the command prompt and the PowerShells. And if there's nobody actually using the system, there's no reason for all that. So as soon as an analyst comes in and sees that, it's going to be pretty obvious for us. But we do have the access we need. We're in and we're staying in. Obviously, we could set up some better persistence, kind of like how we did on the first scenario. But what I want to do instead is actually play around with some of the post-exploitation modules. I'm not sure how compatible they are with all the older versions of Windows, but we can play around with a few off the cuff and see what we can gather. So if we say help, one of the things that we can do is actually invoke Mimikatz. So that's a module that's kind of like built in. So we'll run that and see what we can get. All right, looks like the agent picked up the job. All right, that didn't seem to work for us too well, but that's all right. So what we'll do now is actually search for other modules that we want to use. So we'll say search module persistence. Maybe we can find some cool persistent modules. And sure enough, there are a lot of neat persistence things. So we'll peruse these. Looks like we've got some PowerShell stuff. So we've got PowerShell persistence, add net user. Okay, that's a cool one. Elevated registry persistence for WI subscription, schedule task. Even gives us an easy detection, moderate detection. Gives us kind of like a standard rating based on kind of what they've seen, I guess, in their research. All right, so let's take a look at the elevated task persistence module. That seems fun. Go back to our help again, and we'll say use module. This one. Oh, I guess maybe we should tab complete it out to see what it gives us. Use module. Okay, this is much more helpful. So we'll say persistence, and we'll say. This is great. Okay, so we have registry, scheduled task. So yeah, elevated scheduled task. Cool. And see what info we have here. We want to set our listener, of course. Otherwise, this is pointless. And we'll want to take a look if there's anything else we want to change. Updater. It's already kind of inconspicuous as it is. Not bad. Look at the help, and it looks like we can just execute this module. It's not OPSEC safe, but that's all right. We don't mind. We know we're going to generate some stuff. All right, cool. We've established some persistence. It's going to trigger at 9 o'clock. Awesome. That is super cool. So let's look at some other modules. So if we search module, let's search for Mimikatz since that didn't work earlier. All right, so let's say use module. We're going to use credentials, and we've got some Mimikatz. We've got a couple different Mimikatz things here. Let's do an LSA dump. See if there's anything we need to set. Nope, doesn't look like it. So let's just execute it. It looks like our PowerShell variant of Mimikatz is kind of causing some issues when it comes to Windows 7 and in this context of Empire. Not really sure why. Could just be maybe invoke Mimikatz is too new. And obviously, you're watching me kind of fumble around Empire a little bit. We're kind of exploring together. But that's the kind of activity I want to encourage of you. I've personally only used Empire about maybe 3 to 5 times on a handful of engagements. It's not really the C2 tool of choice for me to go to. Usually I'll go with something like Merlin or some modified Metasploit type thing. It really just depends on what you need. That said, Empire is still a great tool, and I practice with it as often as I can in my lab environment. But just remember, there's lots and lots of options out there that have lots and lots of features. And Empire is one of those that's really focused on post-exploitation. So it's really good for this kind of red teaming mindset and the kind of infrastructure development and operations that go behind that. So hopefully that's really helpful in how you explore and take a look at other C2 tools that you experiment with. And remember, go take a look at Merlin and see how you like it. So that concludes our Dropbox scenario. Obviously, the focus here was more about the Dropbox and how you could use that kind of configuration on a real engagement. The C2 stuff was more just to show proof of concepts and encourage you all to go play and learn more about other toolkits that are out there. In the course materials for this section, I'll link a few more popular C2 tools for you all to get started on your exploration. That's all for this lecture. I hope you've all learned a lot as usual.